France, Italy, Belgium, Spain. 4 leading European economies. All 4 have witnessed mass protests in recent days. All 4 happened because of exactly the same reasons. Rising food prices, out of control energy bills, and lower wages. Basically, the ongoing cost of living crisis. It is now hitting Europe hard. Today, Europe witnessed one more protest in France. Yes, the European power is quickly becoming a hotspot for these protests. Just look at these visuals. Over the weekend, we saw large crowds on the streets of Paris, and today, trade unions took to the streets. There was a massive crowd on the streets of Paris. And going by some reports, scuffles broke out between the cops and the protesters. So what do these protesters want? They are demanding higher salaries. These protests are being called Emmanuel Macron's stiffest challenge yet. But he isn't the only European leader who is facing this challenge. The entire economy of the euro area is now being tested. Why is the European economy hurting? That's our cover story tonight on Gravitas. Let me tell you what's happening in France. It was a day of major disruptions. Trade unions called for a nationwide transport strike. The reason, as I said earlier, is the demand for higher salaries. The unions were holding talks with the government. They remain in a deadlock. The move by the trade unions comes after workers at refineries staged a walkout. This disrupted the distribution of fuel across France. Remember these long lines. For nearly 3 weeks, drivers struggled to get fuel. As several fuel depots were closed down, even now French drivers are struggling.
It's been 2 weeks now that the French government says that it will be fixed in the week. What week? We don't know. It's starting to be too long now. We professionals, but also the individuals, we are fed up. Seriously, a solution needs to be found. I live pretty far in the suburbs, and in the suburbs there is no petrol at all. I came to central Paris now to find some. As I am a courier, I need petrol to be able to work. As simple as that.
French President Emmanuel Macron was forced to step in. He issued orders and forced some workers on strike to return to the world. The negotiations have clearly broken down because the French government is in no mood to relent. Recently, the French finance minister declared the time for talks is now over.
I consider the negotiations to have happened. I think the majority has spoken. In my opinion, what we need for the coming days is firmness, authority, a return to normal, and the respect of the voice of the majority. When a negotiation took place and the majority has spoken, the majority's decision should apply. It's called democracy.
Today's protest is a response from the unions. They are clearly doubling down. Workers staged a protest at prominent areas in Paris. They believe the French government is treating them unfairly. Listen in now to what some of the transport workers have to say about this.
Today, the wages at the RATP for someone who comes in, he comes in a bit above the minimum wage. It's 1,400 to 1,500 francs. So it's largely insufficient, given that the company has changed the working conditions since August. We work 1 hour more. I have 15 years seniority at the RATP and I barely get 2,000 euros.
Today there are several reasons, but the main one is the revaluation of salaries. The index point has been frozen for more than 10 years. It was revalued this year by 2.2%. But in the view of the inflation over this year and over the last 10 years, it is not enough for employees.
Now that's the kind of story you'll hear all around Europe these days, because the region is growing through an economic turmoil. Rising inflation is hurting people's pockets. The cost of living has gone up, and the euro area is finally feeling the shock of Russia's war in Ukraine.
The energy crisis, especially in Europe, is not a transitory shock. The geopolitical realignment of energy supplies in the wake of the war is both broad and permanent. Winter 2022 will be challenging, but winter 2023 will likely be worse.
Those words are significant. It isn't a transitory shock. That was the assessment from the International Monetary Fund. Winter is almost here, and protests across the region are intensifying. It seems like people across Europe are already hurting. We showed you these pictures yesterday. Again, they are from France. Thousands of protesters hit the streets on Sunday against rising prices. On the same day, there were protests in Rome. Again, people were demanding relief from rising gas and electricity prices. Similarly, there have been protests in Brussels, London, Madrid, and Budapest. All this in recent weeks. The war in Ukraine has tested Europe's solidarity. So far, they have presented a largely united response against Russian aggression. But the crisis within European economies presents a challenge to their unity. And now, to get more perspective, joining me now from Madrid in Spain is Jamie Martinez. He's an economic advisor. Jamie, thanks for joining us. Now, my first question, we're seeing protests across France over the cost of living crisis. In fact, Europe is on the boil. We saw some visuals, in fact. Do you see this crisis getting worse?
Yeah, this growth, as I said before, the growth in the level of prices is giving more pressure to the labor and trade unions in France, which now they are asking for higher salaries and announcing national strikes in the country. Of course, this gives more pressure, and there is a big political risk for the government of Macron, which is now working the national budget for the next year, for 2023. And for sure, we can expect that the situation is going to get worse, because the labor unions in France are very strong, and they are going to demand higher salaries, a great increase. But I think that despite these risks, wage increases should be moderate to avoid an inflationary spiral where the new wages fuel additional price increases.
Right, Jamie, the entire economy of the euro area is being tested. My question to you is, did experts and analysts anticipate this?
I think the European Union, in terms of economy, is now facing a huge risk of recession. As for instance, the United States, it went into a recession in the last semester, but now the European Union is having a lower economic growth in terms of consumption, investment, and of course also in terms of exports, because this problem of the inflation is affecting worldwide. But that's why I think to tackle the problem of this high inflation in Europe, it is necessary to reduce the public spending of the government. For instance, talking about France, the public spending in terms of GDP is 59%, which is very high in comparison with other countries of the OECD.
Right, you raised some valid points about what needs to be done, but my question now is, what happens from this point on? The French President Emmanuel Macron was in fact forced to step in, but talks seem to have broken down. Is this the beginning of a wider movement, perhaps similar to the Yellow Vest protests?
Well, I wouldn't dare to bet if it is going to be that worse in terms of if this movement is going to export in the whole continent of Europe. But yes, of course, we can expect more pressure for all the trade unions in Europe, claiming higher salaries. And I think governments in Europe, they will have to respond with more moderation. Because, of course, we can understand that workers are claiming more salaries, but as I said before, we can avoid, if we want to avoid inflation spiral, all right, we have to be very moderate with this increase of salaries. and also doing so and maybe reducing the government spending, the public spending. The fiscal policy of Euro will be in coordination with the monetary policy addressed by the European Central Bank.
Right now, Jamie, thanks so much for all those inputs and thanks for joining us on Gravitas. We'll, of course, continue to get you all the updates of what's happening in Europe, all because of the cost of living crisis. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.